people are not so much turning up to hear, this is my interpretation of it, they're not so much turning to hear a message about Jesus. They're turning up to meet Jesus.
So, hey, welcome to this podcast once again. Welcome to Quiet Revival is what we're calling it, Gen Z Men and their Return to Faith. And I've been just really encouraged by the conversations that we've been having. This is episode 5, and I'm excited to speak with our guest today. Some of you are very familiar with him already. You listen to him on his own podcast. He's got a podcast called Rebuilders. He's written 8 books, but several of them with Moody Publishers, which I'm really happy about. Some of you may have read Reappearing Church, which has gotten a lot of attention. Non-Anxious Presence was powerful. I read that one, by the way. And then I think this is the latest, called Platforms to Pillars. Our guest is a pastor of a church in Australia called Red Church, and has a real passion to understand culture and see what God is doing in culture. Married with a couple of kids, and his name is Mark Sayers. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Fantastic to be here and chatting, yeah.
I know that there's quite a few hours difference. Remind me, between Chicago and Melbourne, how many hours?
I always let the computer do the work, but I can say it's the next day, so I'm coming to you from the future.
Oh, I love that. Hey, that makes sense, right? Mark, you know, we've been talking about what God is doing, especially among young men in the U.S., but I know just by talking to my friends in Europe and other parts of the world that this is something that's happening to different degrees worldwide. Yeah. So you're in Australia. Australia is not the most evangelized place in the world, but God's doing some things. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing from your perspective.
I mean, I might start with a story which to me is indicative of this phenomenon. I, for years, have welcomed different visitors around the world and lots of friends from the US to Australia. And one of the differences is obviously Australia is much more post-Christian and much more secular. And I live in Melbourne, which is probably our very secular city, very sort of progressive city. And, church planters find it difficult to come here sometimes. And so I was with some friends from the US, I think this was in January, and I was taking them around the city, and I took them to the Catholic Cathedral, St. Patrick's, and I was telling them how, secular sort of Melbourne was. And we got to the steps of the cathedral, and I saw someone hunched over, and I presumed it was possibly a person who, was unhoused or homeless. And we got closer, and I thought, wow, there's actually some nice clothes. And, we got closer, and it was a young man, maybe 18, on his knees at the steps of the cathedral with a prayer book, praying. And it was just like, wow. this is quite an unusual sight. And, it sort of also undid my talking about how super secular Melbourne was. And I began to notice, maybe just after the pandemic, a sort of stream into my church of people turning up cold turkey, never been to church before. A lot of the missional sort of thinking was people aren't going to turn up to your church anymore, particularly in cities like mine. But, as I spoke to other people, began to notice this was happening everywhere. So I was just in Europe a couple of months ago, and in Scandinavia, which is very secular, and just incredible stories, places like Finland, Norway, Denmark, where, again, particularly young men are turning to the church in quite unexpected ways. And I remember speaking in Denmark about 10 years ago, and just, wow, this is such a tough environment, beautiful place, but tough environment. Mm-hmm. And the morning I preached in Denmark, a couple months ago, a few months ago, was the front page of the Sunday newspaper was the return of Christianity. And so it's this, I call it a plot twist. And people weren't predicting this, and so you're seeing this interest, particularly amongst the younger demographic, and particularly amongst young men.
Mark, from a sociological perspective, I know we could say the pandemic, just created a lot of uncertainty, isolation. There was, a lot of polarization. Wars have broken out, and economic uncertainty all over the world, and that has certainly been used of God to sort of create this moment. Obviously, I believe that God is sovereign, and so He is blowing with His Spirit to do this. But talk to me about what you think is driving some of this in that 18, 20-year-old that's in Australia, that's causing them for the first time to say, let me look at spiritual things.
Yeah, I remember there was this moment when, so Melbourne was in quite an extended lockdown that was quite, restrictive, and we couldn't go. There was like curfews and you couldn't go certain distances more than sort of 3 miles. So we were almost in that for 2 years. So once it ended, I wanted to go downtown because it's outside of that 3 mile radius for me. And so my daughter and I jumped on the train and we went downtown, and it was still fairly quiet. Like a lot of stores were shut. And we came to there's a historic Victorian era mall called the Block Arcade. And we walked through there and I saw this very long line of young people, mostly, under, I'd say 25. And I'm like, is it a new yogurt place? Is it a celebrity appearance? And we got to the end of the line. There was a figure I could see, and it was a figure that had a green hood on. And as I got closer, you sort of got a shock because it actually had a straw face. It wasn't someone standing there. It was a effigy. I'm like, what is this thing? And I got closer and I realized that it was out the front of an occult store. And it absolutely struck me. I thought, wow, we've just come out of lockdown, and the first place you're going to is to get a psychic reading. We just launched a new location and we got some data on why people are going to this neighborhood. This is not a bohemian hipster neighborhood. But the data we got was that the two top reasons people are going to this neighborhood is to go to two psychic stores. I thought it'd be like this clothing store or restaurants.
Really?
And this is not normal in my city. And so you're seeing, I think, a couple of things. Number one, I think the pandemic taught people that unexpected things could happen. I remember predicting. So I was in Asia just as the pandemic was breaking out. And I'm like, they're locking down. We're going to lock down. I remember telling that to people here, like, nah, it would never happen. Like the prediction machine before them was just to say unexpected things won't happen. Normal is the norm. And so I think you've got a young generation who've grown up like crazy, unexpected things can happen. So they're used to big changes. The second thing is, and this is, you showed Reappearing Church there. The sort of prediction I made in Reappearing Church is that secularism actually is more a structure than it is a series of beliefs. That secularism is higher in countries with higher standards of living and good like safety nets. And so it gives you the appearance that you can live without God. But since the pandemic, because of the economic effects, the geopolitical effects, political effects, that's going away. Secularism is failing. So the line up and say secularism is having its moment of doubt. People are not believing it in the same way anymore. And because secularism was pushed, in a sense, by people who are at the sort of center of power, increasingly as there's a disinterest or distrust of institutions, like I saw the stats, I think, for the US, it's like dropped to 17% trust in political institutions or something like this.
Very
like
low.
Radical.
Yeah.
You're not going to then believe the sort of gatekeepers of the secular story, which is really interesting. So like, it's almost like there was like what happened was, you saw in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a growing distrust of religious leaders. You now see it of secular leaders. And I think the last one is there was this, I remember seeing a statistic about 10 years ago that there's a future point where life outcomes for centuries, life outcomes are much better have been for males than females. Better earning jobs, better education, better social opportunities. And I remember this predictive graph I saw, which basically said at some point, women will get more higher education, they'll be higher earners, They were to have more greater purchasing power. And there was this crossover point. I remember looking at that crossover point, which when I saw that statistic was about 10 years in the future, thinking, wow, that's going to change things. What's going to happen? We've now crossed that point. Now it's not for above like 25, or I think it's either 30 or 25. So many of the attendant problems that women, face in the world are still there. So there's two things happening at once. This is why it's confusing. So above a certain age, many of the struggles women have had are still there, and they're still that for under 25. But the life outcomes for men are really, really dropping. And I think also there was a period too where, men, and look, some of the critique is right, but also there was a sense that, there was almost a sort of all men have a fundamental flaw in them. And so I think younger men are reacting to that. And I noticed that. And I just noticed, like, on the train, in the streets, after COVID, the generation of men I saw emerging, I'm like, they're different. There's something different about them. They walk different. They talk different. So I think, they're the big sort of drivers of what's happening. And just to throw one thing in there real quickly, like, I noticed in Europe, what had shaken Scandinavia was the Ukraine war. There was a sense of existential threat. Countries like Norway are preparing for a potential war with Russia. Conscriptions coming in some of those countries. 18-year-olds are not doing their gap year, backpacking trip across the world. They're preparing for military service, and some of them are on the northern border looking over the ice at Russia. That changes how you view the world.
Yeah. So insightful. Yeah. I hadn't thought of the secularism as a construct when things are going well. Yeah, that's good. Let me ask you this, Mark. When you're a student of history, an observer of culture, that's kind of you. I know that's something that you love to do. Is there any other time in history, as you look at maybe some of the peaks of revival or the waves of revival, that what's happening now seems similar to? As you look back at some of the sort of awakenings, does this remind you of something, one of the awakenings?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, if you look at what's happening now, there's technological change, there's geopolitical change, there's political change, economic change, and social change. And you look at the Great Awakening, all of that was happening. The world was initially moving into a globalization. Trade was happening across the world. The economy was changing. People no longer were like just in a sort of agricultural economy. They were moving to the cities. So you look at these guys like, John Wesley and George Whitefield, they were preaching often to people who'd been dislocated from, places where their families had lived for centuries, had moved into the city, were sort of rootless, and were looking for something. Britain had just come through significant political upheaval and polarization, a civil war. You also saw that the connection of the world, it wasn't through the internet, it was much slower, but letters could get around the world and boats were moving around the world. You see a similar thing in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, Moody's Bible Institute is connected to this story.
Yeah, that's right.
Of the telegraph connecting the world. Like technology, the factory was like AI of that day. The telegraph meant you could communicate. So the US could communicate to Australia in seconds. That was new. And, there's a great story I love of near my city, in the countryside outside of my city here in the state of Victoria, a shepherd came across a fragment of a newspaper. And in that newspaper, there's a sermon, and it had been written down. He reads the sermon, hears the gospel, falls on his knees and becomes a Christian. That was a sermon preached by Spurgeon that Sunday in London, telegraphed to Australia, put in the local paper. And so for me, there's a lot of people get concerned about the cultural dynamics, and I understand that. I have my own concerns, but also I'm very hopeful because history tells us when there's this disruption, and I always say it's crisis precedes renewal. If there's a crisis, people get serious. I actually think the worst time to try and do mission and ministry is in times of absolute comfort, peace, and prosperity. They're nice times to live, so ministry for me is easier now with all the challenges than before the pandemic.
Yeah. and I would totally agree with you, is disruption, upheaval. And, I was hearing your story about post-pandemic people going to the psychic. And I just this Sunday talked to a young lady. She looked like she was probably her mid-20s, and I'd never met her before. And she shook my hand and she said, I'm a new Jesus follower. That's the word she used. I'm a new Jesus follower. She said, I was very involved in the occult, and so was my family. But she said, my eyes have been opened. And she said that this was interesting. She said, I've come to this church 3 times. She said, every time I come, she said, I start crying during worship. I don't know exactly what it is, but I start crying. And I said, I know what it is. It's the presence of the Father drawing you out of darkness to himself. And so, God is stirring things like that up. And it's a very exciting time, a very disruptive time. As you see some of the movement that's happening, you mentioned that it's in Europe. In fact, it's from some of what they called the Quiet Revival in the UK that we got the title of this podcast. It's a little bit different. There's not a central figure, dynamic figure like some of the revivals, the Jonathan Edwards or the D.L. Moody's or the Finneys. It's some people have said, and I'm not sure how concrete this is, but revival is more when a lukewarm church repents, gets on fire, and then starts to spread the news outside. This isn't that happening. This is more like an awakening where society at large is starting to look to the heavens, and the church has to realize, hey, we need to wave our flag and draw people here because people are looking.
Yes.
How would you react to that?
I agree 100%. So it's, there's some like, as listening to the stories, like when I was in Europe, I just was sitting with people, like just hearing the stories. And there's very different things occurring. You're 100% right. It's like the movement is coming towards us. It's not, the church all of a sudden got super fired up and we're going outwards. Right. There's some of that, but in certain places. But what's really surprised me about this, so my logic of revival, having read about it, was like, what's going to happen is there'll be a wave of renewal will move through the church. And again, that is happening in some places. And then it'll get so on fire, it'll go and knock on doors and preach on the street and then bring people into the church. But there's something fascinating happening. Like in Europe, and again, to seeing it here, but it's also Canada, you're hearing stories in New Zealand, different places, is people having encounters with the spiritual, or like straight up encounters. Like I heard a story in Norway of, a woman who basically turns up at a church and is like, I'd like to be baptized. And they're like, oh, have you been exploring faith? And she's like, yes. They find out she's never met a Christian. Basically she sort of cries out to the universe, like, whatever is truth, reveal yourself to me. Yeah. The image of Christ comes to her. And, she then, believes, cries, turns up, and it's like, yeah, I'm in now. And so hearing similar versions of that story, another thing that just surprised me in Europe was hearing stories of multiple people led to church through ChatGPT. I'm not saying ChatGPT's, like
Spirit-led ChatGPT. Hey, exactly. I love it.
God can use anything. You use a donkey, But basically, literally asking questions into ChatGPT and then ChatGPT sending them to a local church, which is bizarre. But also, what really surprised me was very traditional churches who are not expecting people to turn up, having people turn up. So they're turning up at Orthodox churches. They're talking, I know in Australia, the Coptic church is having a renewal. Yeah. They're turning up at, churches where they're not even used to people turning up. And also, interestingly too, lots of people turning up asking for freedom from spiritual oppression. So more people that you think about, the increase in psychedelics, the increase in use of the occult, the increase of use of people, engaged in all kinds of sexual stuff that they wouldn't have generations ago. The more you're sort of, touching up against, forces of darkness there. So I've heard lots of people say, hey, listen, I'm not a Christian, but do you guys do deliverance? Which is fascinating, stuff. And these churches I don't know what to do with this. So, yes, I think all of that. But I guess to sum it up, what I'm noticing is, and there was some research done in Australia around this, people are not so much turning up to hear, this is my interpretation of it, they're not so much turning to hear a message about Jesus. They're turning up to meet Jesus.
Yes. Yeah, that's good, Mark. And, I was just talking to my son who's 31 years old, pastor in the city of Chicago. Chicago's not known, it's not the Bible Belt in America, let's just put it that way. And he was saying the same thing, that the people that he's talking to, they're looking for an experience. It's not just the intellectual, the seeker movement was kind of like, hey, don't raise your hands, don't do too much worship, speak intellectually to them. This was, 30, 20 years ago. I feel like it's all the opposite now, is that people they want an encounter and they're open. It's not something that they're pushing back from. About 3 weeks ago, I met a young lady who's first time in church. She was 25 years old. And I said, so what's your religious background? She said, well, I think I've been to church twice in my life. I said, oh, so did a friend invite you? No. She said, I was looking online. And so I checked things out online, and she said, I decided I would show up. And I thought, how unusual. I don't think 10 years ago I'd have seen that. It's a friend has to invite you. But her spiritual interest, someone with no church background, drives her to get online and look for a church. So God can use, our online streaming, even ChatGPT. I heard of a student that showed up at Moody Bible Institute and said, we said, how did you get here? He said, I put study the Bible, and ChatGPT told me Moody Bible Institute. So I'm grateful.
Wow. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. There's pastors and spiritual leaders that are trying to figure out what to do with what's happening. And if a church is sort of trying to prepare itself to embrace what God is doing, what would be your advice in terms of how we do church these days, maybe different than 10, 15 years ago, to meet this moment? Leadership, community, mission, how we do our services. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I was in a meeting recently, and it was really interesting. There was two conversations. The first conversation was in our city, and this was overseas. In our city, people are turning up to churches, and they're turning up at Catholic masses, and they're turning up at traditional Baptist churches, and they're turning up at Pentecostal churches and Orthodox churches. And then the next conversation was, okay, so what model do we need to create to meet this moment? And my response was, and for years, I love models, I'm down for models. But I just had this moment. I just thought, guys, what if it's no longer about the model? If they're turning up in one city, they're turning up to a super contemporary Pentecostal church. They're turning up to a very traditional Orthodox church.
Yeah.
What's going on here? So for me, I think it's more about, and this is what I'm trying to do at our church as well, is say to people, hey, what we need to do is change a mindset. So I think, I find in my context that I'm so programmed, and a lot of it's through experience, that if I end up in a conversation with someone on the bus and I say I'm a pastor, and in my country you say that people think you're an astronaut from another planet, traditionally up to now, if I say that, they're going to be so repelled. They're going to see me as regressive and all these things. But the new reality is they probably won't. Some will, but the percentage of those who will has significantly gone down. So if in Australia, I just heard some information from the Alpha course, 1 in 4 Australians, if asked nicely, will come to church. That's much higher. I'm not used to that. When I'm on a train, I'm not thinking 1 in 4 people on this train carriage will come to church. So I think we need to change our mentality. And one thing I'm sort of encouraging churches to think about is secularism is weakening. Its story is less powerful, and it could collapse. So prepare. I think we've been so used to years of very sort of like apologetics, which has looked at very reasonable arguments. But what if the
Right.
reasonable society collapses? I mean, I just saw a report yesterday. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, believes that the US government has alien technology and that it's being used by defense contractors. Now, people have been saying stuff like that for years, but not the third most powerful politician in the US. That
Right.
London School of Tropical Medicine I think it's London School of Tropical Medicine, studying the world that users of DMT and magic mushrooms are encountering, because people are encountering the same landmarks in that world and entities.
Hmm.
They're like, what's going on here?
Hmm.
So you're reading The Economist or you're reading the New York Times, and less you're getting the secular thing. You're getting some beliefs which are quite fringe, which have become mainstream. So
Yeah.
I feel like the secular wall is breaking. So we need to prepare for this. So for me, it's less like, how does Sunday service run? It's more like, get ready, Christians. The world that you're used to, and even we're preparing for, may not exist anymore, and there may be a massive spiritual opening. So I just think, real quick,
Yeah.
I think it's about community. People are isolated.
Yeah.
The church is going to be one of the few places where you find community. And
Right.
whatever your church or tradition looks like, spaces where people can encounter the person of Jesus, have people walk with
Mm.
them. Because that's the other
Mm.
thing. So Elon Musk's former partner, Grimes, the electronic music artist, put up on Twitter recently, or X, that she was reading C.S. Lewis, and she's like someone who I would never have thought would see this. She was reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. The reason she said, I'm so embarrassed to say this, is because I'm trying to stop vaping and I'm reaching for something.
Mm.
Now, interestingly, I then noticed like a few months later, she was reading a book, I think it's called Heretic. It's like it's a theologian who's into the Gnostic texts, and was sort of like, there's all these different, so here's an opening, but then she keeps her online like experimentation, ends up in something which is not helpful. So there'll be people turning up because of the internet, but they need guidance, because the danger is people start to believe things. So all of a sudden, the next thing you're having a conversation about Bigfoot or aliens, are angels just aliens, So in your church, people who can guide people, because if it's going to get really wacky, we could start to be the voice of reason. So they're just a couple of things. Having an open attitude, building community, guiding people, but most importantly, positioning ourselves for, I think, a really important evangelistic opportunity.
I love it. And Mark, as I think of what you're saying, there's countries that are less secularized than Europe or North America, places in Africa, that the spiritual, even the sort of the non-Christians believe in a spiritual world. And so they typically are much more adept at challenging spiritual things, because people come with spiritual perceptions, whereas we have been in an environment where people come with very secular perceptions, and we're trying to sort of address those issues. And so I think the church does need to rise up in its meeting the spiritual world dynamics that maybe they're not used to doing. Yeah. Let me ask you another question, Mark. When it comes to men, there's some seasoned men out there that are hearing about sort of this new openness among young men, and maybe asking themselves, hey, I'm 65 years old, I'm 70 years old, how do what does that mean to me? I mean, I'm not sure I can step into that world. There may be even some pastors out there that say, hey, I'd love to sort of tap into that. I'm not really sure if I'm equipped for that. Any words for sort of the more seasoned older men as they ask themselves, hey, what part do I play in all this?
Yeah, I think there's this really interesting intergenerational moment happening. I think the logic of youth ministry that comes in the wake of World War II, where you saw the emergence amongst the baby boomers of a genuine youth culture, was really peer horizontal. So you had youth pastors who were cool and they were like the kids and they could relate. And there's still important stuff to that.
Yeah.
But I think what they're seeing is as young people are less entranced by the culture, like they're less seduced by the culture. Like in Australia, the majority of young people actually don't want social media platforms to exist. They're still addicted to them, but they want a way out of this. So they're less, they still hang out with their friends. They're still going to go and buy a burger with their friends on a Saturday night. But when it comes to voices, they're wanting wisdom. So we live in an information-rich society, but a wisdom-poor society. And so anyone who can model wisdom, one thing I'm noticing in Gen Z, or Gen Z to translate, is a lot of their definition is against millennials. I hear this in my boys. They look at, and it's not because they don't like millennials, but they feel that millennials' lives are not turning out the way that they thought they were. And so I've just noticed this conversation in my kids and others. And so they're like, how do I do life well? How do I be happy? They're even asking questions like, how do I be economically secure in the future? Like housing is a big, like it's only going to be a growing issue for that generation. How do I get married? Marriage seems to be coming back into vogue younger, which is really, really interesting. And, they're asking these things. So there's an element of people who can guide them. But I think also the hang up that a lot of older people have got, because again, too, this has been a lived experience the last couple of decades, is, they're looking for someone cool and relatable. I actually think they're looking for someone who knows stuff that they don't know. That's attractive.
Yes.
And I've just noticed that coming in, like younger people coming to my church, they're often wanting an older figure to connect with. So my encouragement is don't try and be something you're not, but you have acquired knowledge. Arthur Brooks in Strength to Strength talks about that. As you get older, you're not going to come up with new ideas, but you've got a lifetime of wisdom to sort of, not package is probably the wrong term, but to distill and communicate to others. So I just would really encourage
crystallized intelligence,
and pass that on to others. So I think there's a real moment. My wife Trudi, called it the Mary and Elizabeth moment. Like Mary's a young woman, God's doing something in her, goes and spends a time with Elizabeth, who's an older lady, but God's doing something in her, and they spend this time together. And I feel like there's a moment where it's the old and the young. There's this bond that God's creating. A lot of people have hoped for renewal and awakening, and a generation who perhaps are stepping into it. And there's a beautiful relationship being built between those two groups.
I love that. Mark, I could talk for a long time with you and love your heart and your insights as well. Let me just ask you one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up with I'm going to ask you to pray for this generation, if that's okay. But when you look at the 18, 20-year-old, 23, 25-year-old, a lot of boomers or older generation, sometimes they look at that generation and they see a lot of flaws, a lot of things that maybe they didn't see in their generation. Of course, we sanitize the past, but so they can point out a lot of things. And I think sometimes this generation hears a lot of what they're not good at, what they've failed at, what people see in it. What do you see good? What do you see that gives you encouragement and hope when you're looking at 20-year-olds, 19, 23-year-olds? What is it that you see that encourages your heart?
Yeah, I think that there's a sober assessment of life that actually they've seen stuff that other generations didn't. They lived through COVID. They've come into a world where the promises that were perhaps, some of them were slightly mirages. And so I think there is a real desire to get to the nuts and bolts of what it is to live. And I really like that. There is an openness to new ideas. There is I think, a real heart to learn and to, in a sense, cut to the chase and get beyond a lot of the sort of fluff and floss of the world. And I think for me too, this I like the spiritual seeking,
Yeah.
and I think that they're seeing that there's bigger stuff in the world. I think previous generations, the
Mm.
last couple of generations, just got seduced by a very, shiny, seductive view of the world that was an inch deep. And I think they see
Yeah.
through that. They're looking for the authentic, and that word gets thrown around a lot. But I think we're genuinely now authentically at a culture looking for the authentic. And the thing I would say too is, to anyone listening who is in that age group, generations are never one monolithic cohort. I think we position them
Sure.
against each other. I studied advertising at university, and it's an advertising marketing tool. Really, is what generations demographics are. But what it is there's always a remnant in every generation. There are baby boomers I love, Gen Xers I love, millennials I love, Gen Z I love, who've done great things for God. And there's actually commonality. So yes, generations exist horizontally, but there's a vertical, and it's those who
Mm.
live wholeheartedly for God, who are willing to lay everything before his throne, who've dedicated their lives to Jesus. And when they do that, it brings seeds of renewal to their generation. So,
Yeah.
like there may be people listening who you're just exploring this stuff. And I just would say, keep exploring, but this is not less an exploration as much as he is drawing you to him.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
it's a water slide. Just go with the water slide as Jesus draws you to him. And, I'd say to others who, are Jesus followers, there is a real moment here to step into. I think,
Yeah.
us older folks, we can cheer on from the touchline, but it's actually, renewal is going to be, I think, really driven by people within this generation who love Jesus.
Yeah.
So what a moment
Yeah.
to be alive.
What a moment it is. I am so excited about this moment.
Mm,
And I've been pastoring for over 35 years now, and I have never seen the openness, the response to the gospel,
mm,
just the hunger that I'm seeing in this generation.
mm,
And it's given me just a lot of encouragement for the future as well. Mark, could I
mm.
ask you just to pray? I don't know who's
Yeah.
going to be listening to this, but
Mm,
there may be some Gen Z, and there may be
mm,
some pastors or leaders, and however the Lord leads you. But I
mm,
do believe we live in a moment. We want to
mm,
capture it. We want to add fuel to the fire of what
mm,
God is doing, and just
mm,
help people that maybe are discouraged realize, hey,
mm,
God is at work. Let's
mm,
not miss this moment.
Amen. Yeah. Let's pray. Yeah. Jesus, we center everything on you. This is
Yeah.
all about you. And
Yes.
we just recognize that at this moment when we look at the news, it's despair, hopelessness,
Mm.
worry, fear. But we
Mm.
just acknowledge that you're moving history towards your ends. You're architecting where everything is going, and you're drawing people to you. So we just thank you that you're moving at this time. Give us a
Mm-hmm.
kingdom perspective. Give us eternal eyes. Help
Yeah.
us to see beyond the surface. Help us to see people not as the labels that this cultural moment puts on them, but actually people creating your image who you love and you're working
Mm.
in. I just pray for those who are seeking at this moment, may they truly encounter you, Jesus. I think of the
Mm.
people who are tapping away on keyboards, sitting in bedrooms, asking, what is this all about? Desperate,
Yeah.
despairing. May they find you, Jesus. We know that you
Yes.
love them and you're actually out there moving
Mm.
amongst them. And actually, so I pray for leaders. I pray for those in the marketplace, those in the church, as we
Mm.
encounter people. Give us a new perspective to see the opportunity, to actually see abundance of people seeking you, not a scarcity. Lord, we know that secularism, almost fooled us, that it was inevitable and strong. But we know compared
Yeah.
to you, it's actually weak and it's
Yeah.
failing, it's faltering. And so, God, as this happens, may you enlarge our hearts, expand our faith, help us to see the
Mm.
possibilities that are coming. And Lord, I believe that they're only going to increase. I have a sense, Lord,
Yeah.
that things are going to get really wacky out there.
Mm.
So help us to remain true to your truth, your wisdom, your scriptures. Help us to stay
Yes.
close to you, but just be
Mm.
beacons of light in what's to come.
Yes.
And may your church grow. Not
Yes.
just grow in meaningless metrics of, I don't know, hits and
Mm.
people sitting in seats in auditoriums. May it grow in depth and devotion to you, Jesus. And may, as the world looks to the future and frets, may we actually look to the future and see that there is, the kingdom of God coming in fullness. And may we just see evidences of this all around us in our lives, in our families, in our friends, in our streets, in our churches, in our cities, in our nations. We pray this, that your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mark. It's been a joy to talk to you. Could do this for a long time. Let me ask you, if someone wants to just get a hold of maybe more of your material or hear more about what you're preaching, teaching, thinking, any good spot they could go to?
Yeah. So you can go to marksayers.co. You can also check out Rebuilders, a podcast where we talk about these issues all the time, and obviously to being really privileged to partner with Moody through a number of books now. And so, lots of thinking around these issues in those spaces and places.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. There you have it. Mark Sayers, thank you for your impartation today. God bless you.
Yeah, thank you. You too.